everybody. Welcome to Anxiety, Depression, and When It Really Is Illness. We're going to take everything we've done about understanding how our body responds to environments and what goes into somebody feeling a crisis or a really difficult time more intensely, and when it actually is these illnesses. We kind of started with a little bit with panic disorders, our first kind of diagnosable area from the DSM. And we're going to take everything we know and we're going to really dig into the two most common diagnosable mental illnesses for this month. Okay, so this slide is, as I always like to do, but when we start a new lesson, is just kind of remember what are some of the things that we really need to remember that are going to inform what we should be using and learning from this month. So the big ones, again, remembering pathology from our last month with the DSM, is that it focuses on symptoms, and that, not that that's bad, but that it doesn't address root causes. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. The Tylenol example in number 3 illustrates this, and also to think, well, if it's not just symptoms, what is it? And that's where number 2 comes in there, just remembering that, as Brené's taught us, our backstory, um, the 4Bs essentially will be informing a lot of what goes on. Anxiety and depression are both biological in some characteristics and also environmental in some characteristics. The way you can think about it is it's kind of like an addition situation where if you have increased elements of both, you're much more likely to be able to be diagnosed with disorder. There are people who have a lot of one of them, but maybe don't have the other. For example, you may have a streak of depression in your family, but you don't have a lot of the factors yourself, and you've been raised in a particular way that's been incredibly supportive and wrapped around and has protected you from that. So your protective factors might block the likelihood of getting a diagnosable depression disorder. So just really keep that in mind. Okay, we're gonna watch a little video. One of my favorite guys, and you've probably seen him before. He does lots of incredible videos. He's got a crash course on anxiety, which we'll watch for about 8 minutes or so. A key part of it, which is what I want to put on here: anxiety disorders are characterized not only by distressing, persisting anxiety, but by the dysfunctional behaviors that reduce that anxiety. Okay, so what's this really saying? And the video will go into it more, but the key takeaway here is that it has to be dysfunctional, which means it's actually changing your ability to cope with the world around you. You are not in your normal functioning state, dysfunctional. And also that to get rid of those feelings of anxiety, do things that would otherwise not be helpful. You're willing to, for example, with anxiety, you're willing to completely avoid seeing people, even though you like seeing people, because it's giving you a social anxiety. You can, in your brain, at times when you're feeling okay, you're able to recognize that you're making decisions that are not in the best interest, and yet you still feel as though you need to do it. That is the key thing to understanding these diagnoses, is that you actually change your functional abilities so that you'll make decisions that otherwise you wouldn't rationally do. Not much to say here. We'll just do a little bit of a group discussion and a check in on this one. Okay, so going back to 2 slides ago, why would we make those decisions when we recognize they're not logical, when we recognize they're not necessarily in the best interest? Well, there's a couple reasons. One, survival. We need to get through the literal moment, and understanding that something's not good for you in the long term doesn't mean you won't make a short-term decision, right? You might realize that eating a kilogram of peanut butter is a bad idea, but if you're starving, you'll eat it right now and figure out a long-term plan later. The same thing is true for dealing with anxious situations. The other factor is, and we've talked about this a lot, is going back right back to the beginning with our brain unit in the first month, that our brains are meaning making machines, and we will create stories that fit with how we experience the world, and then we will experience the world in ways that then compound our feelings about that. It's very easy once you've kind of created a narrative to then find ways to support that. The brain is not great at challenging itself to stop and pause and say, is this in my best interest, or is it just about surviving right now? And so we will often do things that wouldn't be in our best interest because we've created narratives that suggest they are. Um, an example like this might be, for example, I'm just going back to social anxiety. You've gone to a party and you've realized that you're feeling quite anxious at that party, and so the next time you go home, you leave a little early, and the next time you go back, you realize, or sorry, the next time you think about going back, I should say, you realize, oh, that was really unfortunate last time. I don't want to feel that. I'm going to avoid it, and that narrative compounds each time you don't. And so that's true of a lot of things. A lot of anxiousness is about, as we'll talk about at the end of this, it's about getting through it is about exposing yourself to things that you're feeling anxious about, putting yourself in a situation that you logically know is okay, but doesn't feel okay. So we'll get to that a little bit later. So we've already talked a little bit about panic disorders and we went through the criteria for that. I'm going to pull up the criteria for a few others. You can see here it's going to be GAD or generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety. We'll already have panic disorder and then we'll add in separation anxiety. Just to understand, this is not all of the anxiety disorders, but just to have a real look at like how do they differ and what similarities do we see? What makes something uh, a branch on the tree of the anxiety disorders and what makes this branch different from another branch. So I think it's just interesting to have an understanding of how they differ and how they're similar. Our brains love to look at how things are similar and different. So this is going to be helpful for us understanding the different things that you might look for in yourself or in others to indicate that you're struggling with anxiousness. I've done this 1 year before, and I think it will be fun. We'll look to do it again this year, but I'm going to see if we can get 5 members of the class to come up and essentially act as though they're psychiatrists and collect information using the new criteria they have to see if Mr. Van and his make-believe character that I'll create um, could be diagnosed. It's giant asterisks. None of us are psychiatrists, but just to get a sense of like what does that process look like. Um, and so it'll be a bit of a fun activity, and we'll see what conclusions you come to. And one of the things we'll probably realize is, wow, people have different expectations for what a diagnosis might look like. So it helps give some big perspective, I'd say. Okay, and then these are just going to be some kind of think, pair, share questions, probably, or maybe class share out that I think are worth wrapping up around. And so we'll just talk a little bit about like where do you draw the line? These are spectrums, as we've talked about before. And why would the line be different for one person or one doctor when they're going through this process? What are the what is the importance of understanding how lines in the sand might be different for different doctors or people and presentations? We'll also talk about how, with our understanding that our brains are meaning making machines, that we are always trying to interpret and add to our narratives. How can we use that information with Mr. Van's made up character to support him? And then number three, what might be 2 or 3 questions you might ask to help ascertain what challenges got him? So we've talked a little bit about symptoms not being the whole picture, that they're not the root cause, but it's just what we're seeing. So what might be some questions that you could ask yourself or ask someone to help ascertain what's really going on beneath the surface and how might this person need some attention in certain areas? What are the areas they need attention in? Okay. This slide is just, I know often people are interested in understanding what are the different medications that go in. We'll talk about medications for anxiety, and we'll also talk about medications for depression a little bit later. And I'll refer to this website that I think is hugely helpful for anyone who's considering ever mixing any non-prescribed medications with things. That includes things like alcohol and marijuana and such. So anxiety and depression have a lot of crossover with what's called SSRIs. You can see on the screen there. The challenge is that these can be incredibly helpful, and at the same time, they are some of the least successful on first attempt of any medication out there. Um, our brains are so complicated, and a psychiatrist, by no fault of their own, is going to have such limited data to be able to make an appropriate suggestion for which medication is going to be the most helpful. That there is a bit of a trial and error with this whole thing. That's not to say we shouldn't use medications, and medications sometimes are life altering for some people. But in anxiety and also in depression, we'll talk about it can be quite challenging to get the right dose and the right type and the right brand of medication to help support a diagnosis. It's also worth saying, and you might already know this, but you would never prescribe a medication without a diagnosis. That would be very bad. So we're going to flip the switch a little bit and move a little bit from anxiety to depression. You're going to see there's a large amount of overlap between our two biggest diagnosable areas. But look at depression. The key thing to really know, and you've probably heard of these before. So serotonin and dopamine are two naturally occurring neurotransmissions that happen in our body. One of those, serotonin and dopamine, is actually shown in the chemical equation there with that with our carbon ring there and our oh god, I'm trying to remember my my chemistry here. Um, but either way, do you know which one it is? I'll pause. If you said dopamine, you're right. If you looked it up, nice job. So these neurotransmitters are naturally occurring in our brain, and we know that serotonin is responsible for mood, digestion, and sleep. It is kind of the one that keeps us stable, so to speak, so that our dips aren't too low and our excitement isn't too high. Dopamine is often called the pleasure neurotransmitter, and it manages motivation, focus, attention, mood, and more. It is the one that can give excitability. It's the one that you can feel, it's that like when the first date goes real well, dopamine explosion in your brain. It's whereas serotonin's the one that kind of tries to keep us really in a safe place. So I'll let you think about which one you think is the most effective for depression. Pausing. And trick question, it's both. So that's why they're both there. A lot of people would think it's going to be dopamine. Well, depression must mean sadness, but in reality, actually, it's a lot more to it. All right, let's jump in. Okay, so as we jump deeper into depression here, not literally, but figuratively in our work here, I think it's important to understand that, like anxiety, depression is also you can imagine a tree with a lot of branches that carry different types of depression. So it is there's more than just depression. There's a variety, and I listed the five big mood disorders. So that's depression, that's bipolar, and premenstrual dysphoric disorder. I'm not going to look at that. Disruptive mood dysregulation disorder are some of the big ones. Um, in in reality, sorry, and I should say if you're going, that's only four. The major depressive disorder is going to be another one. We're going to spend most of our time looking at major depressive disorder, which is the most common one people think of, and we will go through some DSM criteria, and as we've done before, I'll have you kind of look through that. And I really want you to think about what might be some of the contributing factors. When we go through this one, what do you think might be some elements from when we looked at worldviews and we looked at like we think about culture and societal values and factors, how might that change the likelihood of somebody being diagnosed? Just understanding how what people in different parts of the world look for and expect as far as um, their involvement with others, because it does play. So we'll have a look at that. We're also going to watch probably not all, but an interesting and powerful TED Talk on why the opposite of depression is not happiness, which I think for a long time, and maybe it's shifting, but for a long time has been a belief that if you're not happy, then you're depressed, or if you're depressed, oh, that's just not being happy, and how inaccurate that actually is. It has, this is the part where we say like, well, isn't dopamine if it's just giving you that excitability and that happiness? So if you don't have that, well, no, the serotonin is huge in depression, and serotonin, as you might remember from a couple slides ago, is our regulation. It's our ability to find motivation. It's our ability to regulate our mood and our interest in food, and you'll quickly see that depression is, as it says, not the opposite of happiness. It's more than what I'll say, but if you had to break it down as small as possible, I would probably say that depression is the inability to find interest in doing anything. Um, it's a numbness, if that makes sense. So the guy who explains it in the video goes through a pretty significant depressive period in his life as well, and he'll do a great job, I think, of explaining it. So you'll see that in class. This is just to say, after we watch the video, we'll do a little bit of a check-in. Nothing you need to do at this point, though. Okay, so we spoke a little bit about medications for anxiety, and there's going to be quite a bit of overlap with depression as well. There's also quite a bit of comorbidity, we call, between anxiety and depression, so you're going to expect to see some crossover with the medications, and often people will be taking a medication that can help with both. So SSRIs, serotonin or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are going to be an important one, like they were with anxiety. I didn't actually explain it last time in the video when we were a few slides ago, so I'll say now that basically the way these work is if somebody is underproducing serotonin, um, what SSRIs do is they block the reabsorption of serotonin. So what happens is serotonin moves through the neurotransmitters in our brain, and if we don't have a lot of it, um, or it moves through too quickly, we don't get the effect. The effect of it actually happens at a chemical level between the two neurotransmitters. If you can imagine two branches in your brain, but times 1 billion times smaller, um, and the serotonin moves through, and then there's a gap. It's called the synaptic gap, and when it moves through, this is where we actually have the experience of serotonin. If there's not enough of it, or it gets pushed through too quickly, we don't get much of the effect. So what an SSRI does is actually kind of blocks it so that the serotonin sits in our bloodstream for longer. And that's what, in theory, is supposed to be able to help us um, feel more serotonin, which is going to help our mood regulate more normally. SNRIs are also used. This is something I know personally less about, but it is a less prescribed, but still also used medication for depression in particular. Lithium, which actually goes back a long, long time and used to originally be used as a mood stabilizer for for bipolar disorder, is something that has been used, but it's not very common, especially not with youth. I'm not familiar with any youth I've known worked with having it. So those are some of the common medications. So Gabor Mate, who I like to refer to, are um, his perspective on this, I think, is valuable, and it's to say that the depictions that we see of depression, which are all about chemical imbalance, um, there is truth to this, but that also that there can be more going on, and depression can be a way of our body numbing and surviving a really challenging event that it's unable to process. So he might say, and I want to be careful to say I'm not sure. I'm personally convinced that it's all times with depression, but Gabor Mate would be he'd have a lot of conviction in saying that depression is how the body and the mind can survive traumatic events from the past. And if you can't work through something incredibly difficult, you can numb out, and depression can be that numbing out. It's an interesting perspective, and I think it's just important to speak to how it's important to understand how much the environmental piece plays here. Um, that again, we can have both a genetic and an environmental aspect for depression, and that the events of our life can really impact our ability to deal with everyday life and our interest in dealing with everyday life, and that depression, as challenging and as powerful and awful as it can actually be a survivalist mechanism to avoid having to deal with some really dark things that maybe have happened in some people's lives. So it's just interesting to think about how depression can be both a chemical imbalance and also be a response to a traumatic experience. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, and we could have a lot more points and probably 20 slides about what helps and what doesn't help, but just to give some things to take away. We know that there's a lot of different modalities, a lot of techniques and counseling theories that can be valuable for anxiety and depression. We know that some medications help, but they're not for everybody, and it's about getting the right dose, and it's about getting the right type to be able to do that, and that can take time, which is challenging. I hadn't mentioned it, but anxiety and depression medications, those SSRIs, the most common ones, you generally need to take them for about 8 weeks before you can see the full effect, and then you need to very carefully come off them if it's not the right one. And so it can be quite a time. It can quite a bit of time to experiment with different medications. We also know that a couple things I just want to put down very commonly for anxiousness, exposure therapy is a big thing. Again, remember our brains are meaning making. Remember our brains create narratives, and if you want to create a new narrative, you need to have exposure to the thing that makes you afraid of. So a lot of counseling modalities will use exposure as a way to help rewire the brain essentially. And we also know that for depression, high value and easily accessible activities, because your mood is so low, if you can find things that are of high interest, high value, but don't require a lot of effort, those are going to be the most valuable things for getting out of depression. Um, in addition to some of the other things we've talked about, like medication. Okay, you've been a wonderful audience. See you in class.